Jesus. Nobody knows the trouble I've seen. Glory, hallelujah. Nobody.
From its beginnings over 300 years ago, ChristChurch has been transformed from a tiny colonial outpost into a significant and growing community of Christian faith centered in Mount Pleasant, South Carolina. In 1698, St. Philip's Church was recognized as the official church in South Carolina under the Bishop of London and Queen Anne. Then in 1706, the colonial governor and General Assembly passed the Church Act, creating 10 geographically bound parishes and establishing the Church of England as the official church of South Carolina. ChristChurch Parish was initially 60,000 acres, defined by the Wando River, Orandor Creek, and the Atlantic Ocean. Today, in historic ChristChurch, traffic noise and businesses now surround us. The church building had been placed here 6 miles from Charlestown Harbor to serve as the parish church for the area east of the Cooper River. At that time, the site was the population center of a community of plantation owners and the slaves who worked for them. The Church Act also named commissioners to oversee the building of churches and homes and farmlands for the clergy. A tax on fur exports raised £330 to buy the site and build ChristChurch. In 1707, construction began. The Reverend Edward Marston held the first services here before the building was complete. 7 men swore an oath to become the first vestry or governing body. The term vestry originally referred to a room in an Anglican church where records and vestments were stored and meetings were held. In South Carolina's colonial times, the vestryman served as the local government, and parish churches were public buildings. Vestry duties included collecting taxes, record keeping for births, baptisms, marriages, and burials, responsibility for church repairs, payment of clergy, and care for orphans and the poor. The first 7 vestrymen of ChristChurch were members of the landed gentry and wealthy patrons of the church. In 1708, the vestry elected Richard Marsden the first rector on August the 9th. After just 5 months, he returned to England, abandoning, alas, both his family and the unfinished church. The vestry continued without a rector for years. Public and private monies paid for the church's completion and a house for the next rector and his family. The Reverend Gilbert Jones arrived in 1712 to serve faithfully for 9 years in a parish constantly struggling with poverty and malaria. During the Yamasee Indian War, many settlers were massacred, and the Reverend Mr. Jones kept 100 refugees in his own home. Like most missionaries, he felt called to minister to the African slaves, but many slaveholders would not allow slaves to learn, to read, or even to speak the English language, let alone to be taught the Christian faith. And this frustrated missionary efforts. At the time of the Reverend Mr. Jones's departure, 107 families lived in the parish, 400 freemen, 630 slaves. But commitment to parish life was discouraging, as one year only 17 members attended the Christmas Day service. The next rector lasted 2 years. The church building had survived 16 years, but was deteriorating. The vestry decided not to repair it, but instead to build a new and larger church. Then, An accidental fire destroyed the original church in February 1725, before fundraising was complete. The fire pushed forward the beginning of new construction. In 1726, services were held yet again in an incomplete building. In spite of the recurring themes of abandonment and adversity, the struggling church persevered. 5 different clergymen held periodic services over the next 2 years, but there was no rector. When the Reverend John Fulton arrived in 1730, he reported the new brick church lacked doors, pavement, pulpit, and chancel. Perhaps these daunting conditions drove him to drink, for in 1733 he was dismissed for being an inebriate. Still, the congregation persevered. 18 churchmen and 1 woman bought titles to the pews, finally providing enough money to complete the church. The tradition of pew rental lasted into the 20th century.
And I've been in the church since 1932. It consisted of about 2 or 3 families, and we had our special pew. It was right next to where the stove was.
No, I was just going to say one thing interesting about our old church was every pew had a door, and every family sat in the same place every time. But when Sid Holt came, he said it didn't look very welcoming to people that came to visit, and he made the vestry take the doors down, and they've stayed down ever since.
All aspiring colonial missionaries endured a dangerous back and forth Atlantic crossing to England because there were no bishops in the colonies to ordain them. Also at this time, the dangers of frequent slave rebellions resulted in a law requiring parishioners to carry guns to church for self-defense. Once the Reverend Mr. Fulton left, the new doors were closed. 2 years later, the Reverend John Fullerton arrived and was well liked. Unfortunately, within just 6 months, he died of malaria. In quick succession, 7 more clergy came and went before the church doors closed again in 1739.
Managed to survive the constant challenges.
In contrast to the frequent succession of clergy,
finally, the
many
Reverend Levi
vestrymen,
Durand arrived with
like
his family in
George Hedrell,
1740.
managed to
Reverend
survive
Durand was
the
born in
constant
London in 1708, the
Mr.
year the
Hedrell
first
himself
rector of
served the
ChristChurch
parish
had been
for
elected.
20 years.
Durand gave 11 years of service filled with personal sadness. His
Finally,
parsonage
the
was
Reverend
built next to an
Levi
inland swamp.
Durand arrived
Consequently,
with
his
his
wife
family
Charlotta
in
died of
1740.
malaria
The
just
Reverend
2
Mr.
days
Durand
after giving
was
birth
born
to a
in
son.
London in
She was buried
1708,
beneath the altar.
the very
Their
year the
newborn
first
son
rector
would
of
live
Christ
only
Church had been
6
elected.
months. And a year later,
Durand
their
gave
daughter
11
died
years
shortly
of
after
service,
Reverend Durand
marked,
married his
however,
second
by
wife.
personal
Sarah Boone, who
sadness.
became wife of the
His
vestryman
parsonage
Andrew
had been
Rutledge,
built next to an
is buried underneath her family pew.
His
This
parsonage
was
had been
possible
built next
because
to an
removable
inland
flat stone
swamp.
paved the floor at that time.
Consequently, his wife, Carlotta, died of
1751
malaria
was a
just
pivot
2
point
days
for growth and
after
change.
giving birth to a son.
That year, the last recorded skirmish with
She
the
was
Indians
buried
took place
beneath
at
the
Portier's
altar.
Bluff. Levi
Their
Durand
newborn
left, most
son
likely
would
taking
live
the
only
new
6
Hobcaw
months
ferry
and a
that
year.
linked the parish to Charlestown.
I think I'm going to start this
Levi
whole
was
section.
the last missionary sent from England by the SPG, the Society for Propagation of the Gospel. Once
Finally,
again,
the Reverend
Christ Church
Levi
was left
Durand
without a
arrived
rector.
with his family in
Many Christ
1740.
Church parishioners were well-known
Reverend
leaders.
Once
of
the Reverend
Durand
Mr.
was
Fulton
born in
left in
1754.
the new
Charles
doors
Pinckney
were the
purchased
very year
his
the
farm.
first rector of
His
Christ
son,
Church
also
had been
named
2 years
Charles,
later,
would serve on the
Reverend
vestry,
John
become a
Fullerton
framer
arrived
of the
and
United
was
States
well liked.
Constitution, Governor of South
Unfortunately,
Carolina,
within
U.S.
just
Senator,
6 months,
and
he
Minister to
died
Spain.
of malaria.
2 other men of the parish, Thomas Lynch Jr. and Andrew Rutledge, signed the Declaration of Independence. Like his grandfather, John Mott, who served on the first vestry, Jacob Mott was elected in 1759. He built a house facing the Charlestown harbor, giving his new home the name by which the entire community would later be known, Mount Pleasant.